This is one of my most recent YouTube thumbnails, and I'm going to show you exactly how I made it. First, I took several pictures of myself, kind of outlining the pose that I wanted to use, which was me holding my phone up to the screen and pointing at it to show off the Instagram sticker GIFs that I made. You could probably adjust the settings on your camera so that everything will be in focus in one photo, but I kind of like the unrealistic look of layered elements of the photo. So I like to take my photos with the depth of field still on so that I can cut them apart and put them back together exactly how I want them to be. I made a new Photoshop file that was 1920 by 1080 pixels at 300 dpi. Then I dragged in the base photo that I wanted to use and resized it to fit into the canvas. Then I opened the other photos with the elements that I wanted, like my hand pointing and my hand holding the camera, and did rough selections around those parts I wanted to cut and paste them into my other file. I used the select subject button to select myself in the base photo, and then I zoomed in and cleaned up some of the selection as it always misses some parts of my tattoos and the brim of my hat for some reason. Once I had the selection the way I wanted it, I went ahead and added the layer mask so that it was just my head and body cutting out my hand holding the phone. Then I adjusted the other photo of my hand holding the phone into place, and this time I used the pen tool to select around it because the quick selection tool and select subject button weren't really doing it justice. Once I had the shape trace with the pen tool, I went ahead and added a layer mask. Then I could move this around and position it exactly where I wanted it on the canvas. Then I double-clicked the layer mask to get into the options. I chose a preview option that I thought would help me be able to see what I was adjusting the way I like it, and adjusted some options on the layer mask to make it look really good and clean. Feathering some of the mask kind of got me some weird edges here, so I decided to just zoom in and clean them up by hand using the brush tool on my Cintiq. When that was done, I used the object selection tool to select my hand from the other photo, and it still didn't quite get it right. There's always a problem with my tattoos, I don't know why, but I was able to easily clean that up using the quick selection tool. Then I applied another mask to this layer and positioned it roughly where I wanted it. There were some weird highlights on my hands, so I decided to use the camera raw filter to adjust the highlights and shadows to get my hands looking a little bit more natural and like the color and shading that I wanted. Then I messed with the position of my hand just a little bit more to tweak it a little bit closer to where I wanted it to be. I had this image of a sky downloaded from Envato Elements, so I pasted that in the background and adjusted it to scale to fit the canvas. Then I adjusted the levels to kind of darken up the blue and provide a little bit more contrast between the blue sky and the clouds. Making the background lighter exposed some really bad edges on my head and shirt, so I went in and cleaned those up manually with the brush tool again using my Cintiq tablet. I used a slight feather brush on the edges of my beard just to kind of get a little bit more natural edge and fade out on those small fine hairs. Then I used levels to darken up my shirt because I felt like it was blending into the background a little bit too much since I wore a slightly lighter shirt in the thumbnail photo than I was actually wearing in the video. But using the levels and a color balance got me to a much closer shade and tone of my shirt. I moved my pointy hand around a little bit more just to kind of get some fine adjustments. And then I made a blank layer underneath both of my hands and painted in some shadows just using a feather brush. This creates just a little bit of separation of the foreground and also kind of leans into that overly photoshopped, kind of super fake look that these thumbnails usually have. I changed the blending layer to multiply and lowered the opacity so that it was a little bit more subtle. This also exposed some weird edges on my finger, but this time I just went into the layer mask options again by double clicking the mask and adjusting the mask edge to bring it in just slightly. This is a better option than drawing around them because this space was so much smaller and the edges around my hand and finger could still be a little sharp. Then I started adding in some layer adjustments above the photo just so that I can play with the levels and different colors and even add in a warm tone photo filter. You can really change the details of this photo using things like levels, curves, hue, saturation, color balance, and really anything that you need to do to adjust your original photo to make it tie into the background and stand out really well on the homepage of YouTube. There's a reason why these overly photoshopped and like really crazy looking images of people stand out, and some of it has to do with how unnatural they look. It's like a totally different game from editing photos for photography and making something look really natural but still have a tiny bit of pop to it. This has like a ton of pop, and sometimes it's just so unnatural you can't help but look at it and click on it. I pasted in this screenshot from Instagram showing my sticker GIFs, and I accidentally broke the hierarchy of my layer styles, so I had to readjust my layers and make sure that they were only affecting the image of me. And then I made sure that the screenshot layer was all the way below everything and just above the photo of my phone. Then I used a mask so that you could see my thumb over that screenshot, and I set that layer to screen. After all the photos were composed, then I started to put the text on my image, and this part is kind of hard. Like, you really have to have the exact right text. You want to have as little text as possible, and sometimes no text at all. But this one, I felt like it required it a little bit, like it needed some context. So I just had to play around with the phrasing until I got something exactly right. And I was struggling with the word Instagram, so I decided to go to Google, grab a Instagram logo, and then go ahead and paste that in the thumbnail in place of the word Instagram. After messing around with the positioning a little bit more, I decided that there needed to be some separation between the photo of me and the background. So I duplicated the folder of all of the elements of me in the photo, and then I flattened it, and I filled that whole thing with a white color, and then I used the Gaussian blur to just kind of give it some feather, and then I also set that layer to overlay and lowered the transparency so that the glow around me was super subtle. Then I played around with the coloring of the letters, because sometimes you want to use colors that are actually in your image, but you know, a lot of times just black text or white text is going to be the best option, but sometimes it's hard for either of those to stand out depending on what your image looks like. So then I went ahead and played with strokes and drop shadows to try to see if any of that stuff would work. And eventually I landed on a drop shadow that didn't have any feathering at all, but I went ahead and changed the color blending mode to overlay so that it wasn't just a solid color as the drop shadow, and it kind of took on some of the properties of the photo behind it. It was a little bit more subtle and more to my liking than just using a black or white drop shadow. And after some final tweaks on the positioning of everything, my thumbnail was done. In real time, this took me about 30 to 35 minutes to get everything the way I wanted it. And this was not one of my more complicated ones, but I did want to put a little bit more time into it just to make sure that it stood out just enough and didn't look super boring. I taught myself some of these techniques by recreating some thumbnails of Ryan Trahan's. And if you want to see me do that, watch this video. All right, guys. That's it for this one. Thank you so much for checking out my channel. And like always, we'll catch you on the next one. Bye.